Muy buenos días. Esta mañana contamos, para proseguir el trabajo sobre el tema central de Encuentro Madrid, ¿en quién podemos confiar?, con el profesor Mikhail Ignatieff.
Hola, buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a este encuentro en el que vamos a debatir con el profesor Ignatieff sobre la confianza y el bien común, sobre política, sobre la sociedad y sobre algunas de sus ideas y experiencias sobre estas cuestiones. El profesor Ignatieff es presidente de la Universidad Central Europea, actualmente en Viena, normalmente basada en Hungría. Ha sido profesor en diversas universidades, entre ellas en la Universidad de Harvard, donde ha dirigido además el Centro de Derechos Humanos. Ha sido periodista, tiene una larga y extensa carrera dentro del mundo de las ideas y de la experiencia de la política, y no en vano fue político en su tierra natal, en Canadá, durante varios años, en concreto entre el año 2006 y el año 2011 en el Parlamento de Canadá. Profesor Ignatieff además ha sido Centennial Chair del Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs en Nueva York, y bueno, pues eres una de las, permíteme que así lo diga, una de las mentes más preclaras en lo que toca a la reflexión sobre la política internacional, sobre la cuestión de los nacionalismos y también sobre derechos humanos y en general valores políticos y valores éticos. Así que muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y si os parece comenzamos directamente con la pregunta y Rafael, por favor.
Good morning, Professor. In your book, Ordinary Virtues, you travel around the world visiting big cities and remote places, observing peoples and asking questions. There you write that ordinary virtues, trust, honesty, courtesy, tolerance and respect, are the operating system of any community. Why is trust such an important piece of life and society? Is trust an innate sentiment?
Thanks for the question, and it's great to be with my friends in Madrid. I think I should disclose that David Blasquez was a former student of mine at Harvard, and I'm going to embarrass him, but he was a very good student, so it's great to do it together with both of you. Let me get to the question. Trust. Trust is the kind of ethical bond at the heart of every society. If you get right down to the places I went to in the book that you cite, if you go to a favela in Rio de Janeiro, the critical question is whether the local inhabitants who live in these shanty towns on very steep hillsides on the edges of Rio de Janeiro, whether they can afford to trust the police. The trust with the police is crucial. If the police are predators, if the police are ripping them off, if the police are assaulting their daughters, if the police are taking bribes, the whole fabric of trust in that community begins to disintegrate. And then the favela begins to trust other people, that is, the drug dealers, the people with weapons. And so that's a negative example, but an important one of just how constitutive trust is. We take it for granted. In Madrid, I hope, in Vienna, where I'm speaking to you, I sort of trust the police. I don't clench every time a police officer in Vienna passes me by. I trust that he will not arrest me for no good reason. Trust, therefore, is then connected to the rule of law. Trust is connected to institutions. And I don't think you can have a society that is a free society where people can walk the streets and engage unless there is a kind of constitutive element of trust. First of all, with the officials of public order, like the police, and then trust spread more generally. I mean, when you walk into a shop and you buy a pint of milk, you want to know that the guy isn't ripping you off. Uh, the more you look at it, trust is constitutive of every one of our relations. This moment, this instance that we're having right now, I've agreed to do this interview with you and this discussion with you because I trust you, because I know you're not going to set me up for some damn stupid question that is embarrassing or humiliating, right? I mean, all these tacit assumptions flow through every encounter we have. And when trust is damaged, when trust is broken, what happens? We flow back to isolated individualism. We cease to trust anybody around us. Our whole attitude towards the world becomes suspicious. And this is immensely destructive of the things we love about society, which is being together with each other.
Well, thank you, Professor. And linked to this is in your book, which we've been reading, and it was really useful and interesting to us. You, I think you quote a study that it says, that it found that resilient, what makes societies resilient during crisis and difficult moments are high levels, and this study says, of faith in institutions, and all the factors that it also says as very important, high social trust, right? And it was striking to me because now listening to you, when what we observe is that like trust, social trust is it's sort of damaged. It's not in its highest moments. So you've been a politician, you are a professor, and you are a very acute observer of politics and society, and we wanted to ask you what can make trust. So how can we rebuild trust? Is it possible? Is there hope in this sense? How do you see that? And you also you also live in a society and has lived an experience at the Central University, European Central University, that is linked to this trust. So how do you see this?
Well, trust can be broken. There's no question. You referred to our particular story in Hungary, and very briefly, we trusted the Hungarian government. We had been in Hungary for 25 years. We had no problems with the Hungarian government. And from one day to the next, they suddenly changed the rules without any consultation to drive us out. So trust was broken. That's a very specific example. Politicians can break trust by violating the rule of law, and then suddenly you're in a kind of Hobbesian situation where it is not the rule of law, it's just the rule of force and coercion. So trust can be broken. I think you made a connection between trust and resilience. In the book, one of the most moving examples to me of trust surviving a catastrophe was in Fukushima, Japan. You'll all remember there was this terrible triple event in Japan in which there was a earthquake, tsunami, and a nuclear release in Fukushima. And thousands of people were killed. And there's a moment when you suddenly discover why trust is so essential, because the national government wasn't functioning very well. The company that ran the nuclear plant was just not in control of the situation. The people who came through for the people of Fukushima, the frightened people who had been seen their livelihoods wiped away, people swept away by the tsunami, and this nuclear plume over their heads. I mean, it was really like the end of the world for these people. But the institution that did not break were the municipal governments. They were the people who loaded people onto buses and got them to safety. They were the people who found them shelter for the night. And so people trusted these authorities. They were local citizens who just did their job. And that was a pretty inspiring example to me of the connection between trust and resilience. Had the municipal authorities broken apart, I think the Japanese society in that region would have fallen apart because there was no authority that they could trust. Happily, there was an authority they could trust, and I think the society came through the crisis much better than you'd expect. All that tells me that trust in government, trust in institutions, is absolutely vital. And it is conventional, in Spain, in pretty well everywhere, to be suspicious of institutions, suspicious of the municipal government, suspicious of national politicians. In a good and healthy democracy, we're always suspicious of our elected officials, and we should be. But let me tell you, when catastrophe strikes, you really do want to have competent, panic-free public officials who tell you what to do. And that allows me to shift to COVID-19. We're in the middle of a global catastrophe. I mean, it is a catastrophe of more than 1 million people have died. And it has been a tremendous test of trust in public officials at every level of government in every country in the world. And we now know, because we can look at the comparative statistics, that some societies where there is high degrees of social trust have done much better than societies where there is low degrees of social trust. I do think that in the United States, there is the fact that 235,000 Americans have died in one of the most advanced societies in the world tells you something worrying about the erosion of social trust between politicians and officials and the people. And there's been an ideological attack on public officials, on government, on scientific advisors that has made trust more difficult to sustain because these officials have been systemically attacked by partisan politicians. And so trust, I'm getting you to see that trust is a heavily political issue. Trust is maintained if until the moment when officials are attacked, when scientific advice is attacked for partisan reasons. Social trust depends crucially on a sort of rough political consensus which seeks to sustain trust in public officials. And when that's been damaged, as it has been in the United States, the consequence, in my view, is a lot of people died who didn't need to.
And let me just go deep on this, because so on the one hand we see that lack of trust on politicians and public institutions, but on the other hand we see a sort of a great trust in certain figures, certain politicians, certain like models of communication and people saying things. So it seems like a paradox that we don't believe in people anymore, or politicians, because they've done bad things, blah, 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 or institutions. On the other, we seem more naive in the way we trust in the alternatives. So is it possible to sort of have a way of trusting that is not naive and that is reasonable? So how do you see that? Because you've also lived, I believe, this experience.
That's a very good way to put it. When we talk about trust nowadays, it makes it sound naive. You put your finger on something important. So how do we have a form of trust that is reasonable, grounded in reasonable assumptions? I think one of the paradoxes here is that you would think that we now have social media, we now have access to the internet, we now have access to information that's just unthinkable 25 years ago. And yet that has somehow eroded trust in the sources of knowledge. It's another paradox that I don't understand. You would have thought that more information and more knowledge would reinforce trust in authority. What it's led to, on the contrary, is an increasing contestation of authority, including scientific authority. And so we've had an extraordinary debate in the United States in which it's become a matter of vigorous partisan polemical debate whether you should wear a mask or not. This has not happened mostly in Europe, I think in Spain and in most European countries. Wearing a mask is not a partisan political matter. It appears to be a judgment we trust. We are told that you can reduce infection if you cover your mask and face. We trust that piece of information, that piece of knowledge, because we've received it from scientists who've studied this illness and know that it has this form of transmission which can be reduced with a mask. Well, there are lots of other countries, and the United States is an example, where people don't trust that piece of information. They think it's just an ideological infringement on their liberty. I find that shocking. I'm puzzled by that because we've gone from the respectable and honorable mistrust of politicians that should be constitutive of every democracy. It is keep your promises, show me what you've done, test these rhetorical promises against the evidence. That's core of democracy. We've gone from that, which seems to be a necessary rational mistrust, to a total distrust of public authorities, including people who are not even in the political arena, like science. And that's extremely concerning. I think the other dimension to add to this, and this may be relevant possibly to the Spanish case, is when politicians argue, when levels of government can't agree, it diffuses mistrust across the whole system. Politicians at all levels, municipal, regional, national, have to be, as we say, on the same page about a thing like a coronavirus epidemic in order to maintain public trust. And when they argue and when they debate, it can have a destructive impact on public trust. And I think we're seeing that in some countries. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Going ahead with some of the questions we wanted to make you. You are a strong believer of universal values, and you wrote about them and fought for them. Then you have traveled around the world asking people about universal values. What did you learn from this experience and from this defense of universal values?
Well, I've been a lifelong believer in human rights and a teacher in human rights. I think the surprise when I went around the world, and we went to Myanmar, we went to Brazil, we went to South Africa, we went to the United States, we went to right around, and to Japan. What I discovered there is that universal human rights has very little daily impact in how people make moral judgments. Just as all politics is local, I actually think all ethics is local. Not indefinitely, not universally, but people put their own people first. Spaniards care about Spaniards more than they care about the universal human rights. David cares more about his new family and his wife and his child than he does about anybody else in the world. You, Sir Raphael, may care about people in your own family much more than anybody else, if you're honest. I care much more about my wife and kids than anybody else. Our ethics is very partial. It's very local, and it's very personal. We make lots of excuses, moral excuses, for people who are close to us that we don't make for people who are farther away. And human rights, I think, exists and has a function, an important function, in kind of tempering that. It's a kind of discipline against the partiality of our local preferences. Because human rights is always telling us something like this. After all, they are also human beings. So when we see somebody drowning in the Mediterranean, and we had a recent terrible drowning in the Mediterranean, in the Western Mediterranean just days ago, with horrific footage of people dying and a woman saved in a life raft crying after her child. The first instinct is frankly to say, oh, those are black people trying to come to Europe to get a better life. That's the partial response. They're different from us. They're poor, they're black, they're desperate, and we don't want them there. And then you see them drowning, and you see that woman crying for her child, and a kind of human rights universalism does kick in. You start to think, after all, she is a human being just like me. And I understand her desperation, panic, and fear and despair at the thought that she's losing this child. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's not to discount human rights. It's just to get us to understand that human rights and what I call the ordinary virtues are in a constant conflict with each other. Human rights tries to pull us back to a universal understanding of our obligations to human beings as such, but our own ethical, the ethical psychology that we live by gives very strong preference to us and our own as opposed to them. And ethical life is a battle between our obligations to us and our obligations to them. And human rights is the vehicle for our obligations to them, but it's fighting a difficult battle inside our own hearts.
But in that sense, what's the role of ordinary virtues that you talk about? How ordinary virtues can be in dialogue with this conception of human rights? Because in a certain sense, life, as you said, seems to be more about concrete experiences. How do you think that this attention, this fact of taking into account particularity doesn't lead to exclusion or a certain exclusivism or a certain intolerance?
Oh, sure. I think I'm trying to get at the paradox that a lot of our instincts of exclusion and rejection and intolerance are very closely paired with some of the virtues that we most admire. Love of family, love of country, love of our language, love of our traditions. All those are good things we like in anybody, that they are patriotic, that they're good family people, that they have a strong religious faith, that they love their region. But all of that flips very easily into exclusion and rejection. I value these things, but I don't want anybody else to share them. We have to understand the ways in which very controversial ideas, like controversial prejudices like racism, for example, are deeply related to very praiseworthy qualities in human beings. The preference we have for our own, the natural preference we have from our own. And so moral life is a struggle not merely against the evil sides of our nature. It is also a struggle against the best sides of our nature. That's, I think, the point I want to make as being so important. Patriotism, preference for Spaniards above everybody else, love of our own are wonderful qualities. But their flip side is we don't want anybody in. We don't want anybody to share it. We don't want anybody to disturb our image of what a national community is. So that this battle, not only with our vices, this battle with our virtues is a tremendously important part of our moral life. And a battle with our virtues is, curiously, paradoxically, much harder than simply a battle with our vices.
It's in a. I would just think when you were talking, I was just thinking about that quote of Chesterton that mistakes are. It's a truth that went crazy, and I think what you were saying it's sort of that, which is and you've seen that very closely when you were a young reporter. Now you're a young professor, but when you were a young reporter, you saw that in the Balkans and other places, right? And but let me just.
David, I wish I was a young reporter and a young professor. You know that's not true. I love to hear it, but it ain't true anyway. Ask me another question.
I was a good student, so it's it's fine anyway. But I just wanted to tell this story that I now that my mom passed away, and sorry about this personal thing, but I think I learned this universal concrete through my mom watching the movies, watching the news in the TV, and crying for Somali boys and girls in the 90s, which we spoke about in our classes 20 years after. But I think there's which is interesting for me is how you see this universal sort of getting flesh and getting concrete, and I don't know. I leave it open there, and but it's I think it's an experience that. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's very important to have always to convert your abstract principles or test your abstract principles against concrete reality. It's pretty meaningless to believe in human rights if you end up being someone who thinks, as they do in Hungary and in Poland, let's not have any refugees, let's not have any migrants. I mean, there has to be you have to pass a basic test of consistency in moral life. You can't have universal values floating out there just as rhetoric and not have it anchored in your daily life, in your daily practice. And that's the struggle for all of us. All of us would prefer to be rhetorical universalists and actually in our actual life, give a strong preference to our own. The challenge of moral life is to bring the two together and live them, live them as one. And that's what we need to try to do. And none of it is easy.
It isn't, indeed. Let me just ask you another question, and this is related to COVID and the pandemic, and this situation sort of locked us up in our houses. It did in March and April. It seems it will, or it is actually a fact now again. Confinement measures they were necessary to control the pandemic, and we saw technology could bring the people we love and we feel close, even closer and to our places, although we couldn't see them physically. And for months, or at least that was my experience, our lives followed like hectic schedules, Zoom meetings. I have Skype with these friends that I never talked to for years, but I now speak to them every single week. But we felt, or at least it was an experience to me, that the pandemic, it also made us spend less time with others, and that's a fact, like physically, share less experiences with people we care about, and build less relationships in civil society. So there were no masses, no meetings of associations, no gastronomy meetings. People didn't go to eat together or have a beer. And how did you live this experience? And is there a risk, I'm very interested in knowing what you think about this, is there a risk that this situation could turn us more individualistic? You referred to individualism a couple of minutes ago, and more lonely. So can, and also can social networks or technology be this agora for the 21st century or not?
Yeah. These are deep questions. I'm one of those lucky enough to be happily married, and so COVID confinement was just spending a lot more time with someone I'm very fond of. And so for me, it was just fine. But it was hell for my brother who lives alone. It was hell for one of my children who lives alone. COVID-19 lockdown was really hard for people living alone. And I think we've discovered just how many people live alone. This is one of the untold or undiscussed stories about 21st century life, is just tremendous number of households are single person households. And COVID laid that bare. It laid bare the number of single people living alone who are retired or in their 70s and are vulnerable. For them, COVID was really frightening because they didn't have anybody to look after them. And it revealed some failings in our social services. That is, some of these people literally had no help at all. What will happen afterwards? I don't think, you said that you thought that this digital world would become a kind of permanent world. I certainly hope not. I think what it's taught us, on the contrary, is precisely how important it is to have physical contact with other people. I mean, I just think, you said in passing, every time I come to Madrid, one of the joys of Madrid is going to one of your restaurants and eating and drinking, and not just with my wife, but being in the presence of strangers. I don't speak Spanish, but I love being in Spanish restaurants because I love watching other people talk and argue and fight, and families being together and stuff. Part of that participation in social life we've all missed terribly. And I think it's going to produce a huge wave of going back to restaurants, going to football matches, going to beaches. I mean, as soon as we get a vaccine, people are going to come back to social life like crazy, because I think we've just discovered how much we need it. I certainly do. I think you probably do too. I certainly hope so. I think we've discovered how cold the digital world is. And we don't want to live in a cold world. We want to live in a warm world. Like Madrid on a Saturday night at 10 o'clock. Pray it soon.
We had other questions, and we can go deep on this, but there was also a question that we wanted to ask you. And at Encuentro Madrid, this, which, as you know, it's an initiative we do every year, and this year is digital. And what we are exploring this year is this idea of trust. And we're trying to sort of dive into this experience, also the ideas around trust, but mainly about the experience of trust that seems so strong, as you said, so rooted in every daily experience, but at the same time so fragile, and so as I believe important things that are strong, but also What is trust for you? How do you live this idea of trust? You started sort of letting us know what is trust for you in the questions before, but I'd like to be blunt and ask you, what is trust for you, Michael?
I think trust is derived from empathy from a quality we all have, the capacity we have to make assumptions that turn out to be correct about what someone else is about to do. So trust is not merely kind of predictive calculation about other people's behavior based on statistical inference, right? It's something much more human, which is we know ourselves, we know others, and we make assumptions about what others do. And it's a social relationship built over time, and it's iterative. So it's fragile. It is reinforced when you trust someone and they come through for you. It is damaged when they don't come through for you. It is a constantly stitched and reiterated relationship that we have with authorities, with our loved ones, with strangers. It's reinforced by a set of rules. The rule of law is a crucial maintainer of the linkages of trust because that creates legal predictability. There's administrative rules that make for trust being administratively sustained. But the trust that matters most to us and the breaking of trust that is most shattering to us is in our personal lives. When we trust someone we love and then we discover that they're having an affair, for example, then it's not merely that we're disappointed in them and angry at them and betrayed. Our whole world can disintegrate because we feel we can't trust anything. So that teaches you that these intimate relationships of trust build a whole world of assumptions for us. And when those intimate relations are broken, then we can be personally shattered. So trust is not simply a predictive calculation that someone is likely to do what we think they're going to do. It's almost a form of faith. And I use the word advisedly. It's like a form of religious faith. It's the faith we have that we can live in society without being betrayed. So trust and betrayal are very closely linked. And that's why it's so important. It's the faith that keeps society going. It's the faith that allows us to operate in society without suspicion. And when trust is broken, this sense of betrayal can make us distrust everything and everyone. So it's very human, it's very intimate, it's very personal, and it's very, very important.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to talk to you.
And we hope to see you in Madrid quite soon.
Well, I want to go out for dinner with you.
That's right.
Have one of the late Spanish dinners, which are always such a delight, with wonderful Spanish wine and manchego cheese and your wonderful jamon and all those delicious things.
Yeah, that's
That'll
right.
be great.
That would be great.
Well,
Good.
Professor, thank you very much. Really, thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.